Hey guys, tonight we stand in a land that feels more like a cracked chessboard than a kingdom. The year is around 1280, and you're in northwestern Anatolia, where the edges of the Seljuk Sultanate have frayed so badly they look like an old carpet gnawed by moths. You're standing near Seljuk, a small town with nothing particularly glamorous about it, just herds of sheep cropping grass, the smoke of cooking fires rising in thin threads, and men sharpening their swords under lean-to shelters. But the air smells different these days. There's the scent of dust carried from ruined towns to the east, places emptied by Mongol raids. There's also the heavy scent of new ambition, for you are living in a frontier where every man with a sword and a little charisma believes he could carve out his own dominion. You hear the clash of languages: Turkish, Greek, Persian, Arabic, Mongolian, sometimes all shouted across the same bazaar. At night, flames from campfires dot the hills, not stars but signals of warbands ready to raid. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll get an interesting bedtime story out of it. So, let's walk through the dust of Seljuk together, where Osman, son of Ertugrul, will soon rise from being just another frontier chief to founding a dynasty that swallows empires whole. But before we go deeper, quick pause. If you're enjoying the rise of Osman, birth of the Ottoman Empire, make sure you subscribe for more calm history nights like this one. And while you're here, drop your current location and the local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where across the globe this campfire circle of history stretches. Sleepy salute, and may your pillows be as soft as the cushions in a sultan's divan. Now let's push forward into the dust and clash of 13th century Anatolia. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, once a proud powerhouse stretching across Anatolia, had by now collapsed inward like a tent whose ropes have been cut. Mongol invasions earlier in the century smashed its structure. The Battle of Kozadar in 1243 was the hammer blow. The Seljuks lost so badly to the Mongols that they essentially became vassals, paying tribute and watching their central authority vanish. By the time Osman was growing into manhood, the Seljuk sultans were little more than nervous figureheads in Konya. You live on the frontier, and frontiers are places where law is thin, but opportunity is fat. Along the western borders, small beyliks, Turkish principalities led by chiefs, sprouted like weeds: Jermiyan, Karaman, Aydan, Saryan, Menteşe, all names you hear thrown around, each led by some ambitious bey dreaming of being more than just a cattle thief warlord. But among them was Osman, whose tribe held Seljuk, a grazing land on the edge of Byzantine territory. Imagine you're sitting in the shade of a tree on a hot afternoon, watching Osman's warriors train. They are Ghazis, fighters, who see themselves as champions of Islam against the Christian frontier, but they're also practical men, sheep herders, horsemen, raiders. Their life is a balance between religious zeal, survival, and the thrill of plunder. They raid Byzantine villages, not only for God's cause but also for livestock and grain. War here is less about set battles and more about ambushes in ravines, torching barns, and grabbing prisoners for ransom. Step east with me in your imagination, and you'll find Anatolia scarred by Mongol overlordship. Taxes are crushing. Cities like Konya and Kayseri have seen their trade routes strangled. Local populations are weary, constantly shifting loyalty to whatever warlord can protect them. People are tired of rulers who can't defend them. Into this vacuum comes someone like Osman, not backed by grand lineage or scholarly prestige, but with charisma, military knack, and a reputation for fairness among his people. The land around Seljuk itself is a perfect crucible for this. It's a frontier plain nestled near mountains, with fertile valleys that tempt farmers and herders alike. Yet just across the Sirkaria River lie Byzantine fortresses, relics of a once mighty empire now too weak to guard its borders. If you climb a hill at dusk, you can see the faint silhouette of a crumbling Byzantine tower against the red sky. That's temptation right there. The walls are cracked, the garrisons poorly paid, the villagers weary. For a Ghazi leader like Osman, this is both playground and battlefield. It's worth remembering that Byzantium at this point is also a mess. The great capital Constantinople had only recently been retaken from the Latins in 1261, but the empire was shrunk and fragile. The emperors in Constantinople controlled little beyond the walls of their city and scraps of western Anatolia. The rest was held by local governors, who often acted more like petty lords than imperial officers. So, if you were a frontier chief like Osman, facing these shaky Byzantine defences, you'd see not just an enemy, but an invitation. Picture a night raid. Osman's men saddle their horses quietly under the moon, their iron stirrups glinting faintly. They ride out in silence, only the jingling of harnesses betraying their movement. A mile away, across a river, a Byzantine village sleeps, its people unaware that by dawn their cattle will be driven off and their storehouses plundered. This was the rhythm of frontier life, and slowly these raids did more than fill bellies. They carved out territory, inspired followers, and whispered into the ears of young warriors that Osman was a leader touched by destiny, and destiny mattered. In a time when literacy was scarce and legends spread faster than news, the way people saw a leader was almost as important as his actual deeds. Already, whispers circulated that Osman's family carried an aura of divine favour, a reputation built partly from his father Ertugrul's service to the Seljuks. People loved to follow a man with a story, and Osman was beginning to gather both stories and victories. Step back for a moment and consider the bigger picture. You're in a landscape where Seljuk decline left a patchwork of power. To the east, Mongol tribute lords. To the south, other Turkish beyliks. To the west, the tottering Byzantines. And in the middle, Osman, young, ambitious, and hungry. You might be tempted to say this sounds like a video game map, with power vacuums, weak neighbours, and a scrappy underdog faction poised to rise. And honestly, yes, it was that kind of world. But unlike your video game, if you lose here, it isn't just a reload from last checkpoint, no extra lives, just burned villages and forgotten names. As Osman's story unfolds, the tension in this frontier world sharpens. Byzantine farmers begin to whisper the name of Osman as the man whose raids burn their harvests. Turkish dervishes begin to gather in his orbit, seeing him as a sword for their spiritual mission, and neighbouring beyliks start to keep a nervous eye on him, wondering if this young chief might one day be more than just another nomad warlord. The ground under your feet is buzzing with this energy, a crossroads of collapse and creation. Every hoofbeat, every clang of steel, every prayer whispered at dawn is part of a great transition. You can feel it in the air. You're standing in the opening act of the Ottoman Empire. Osman's tribal roots stretch far back into the soil of the steppe, watered with long memories and nomadic pride. You, standing here among them, would not see a polished empire or a court glittering with marble. Instead, you would see tents stitched from felt and hides, horse herds moving like shadows across the plains, and a people whose lives were tuned to the rhythm of the seasons. These were the Kaya, one branch of the mighty Oghuz Turks, a confederation that had long migrated westward from the endless grasslands of Central Asia toward the fractured lands of Anatolia. If you asked an elder around the fire to tell you who the Kayas were, they would lean in, their beard catching sparks from the flames, and recite genealogy like poetry. They would tell you that the Kayas belonged to the Bozok branch of the Oghuz, descended from the legendary Oghuz Khan, and that their tamga, the tribal seal, was two arrows pointing upward. Symbols mattered here. That tamga appeared on horse gear, banners, and even carved into wood, a reminder of who they were in an era where identity could mean survival. By the 13th century, the Kayas had wandered through Iran and Anatolia, searching for pasture and safety. The Mongol onslaught in the east pushed many Turkic tribes westward, scattering them like seeds in the wind. Ertugrul, Osman's father, led the Kayas during this time of upheaval. Imagine him guiding his tribe of a few thousand souls, families, warriors, herds, through mountains and plains, until they reached the borderlands near Seljuk. This was no rich prize, just a frontier grazing land pressed between Byzantine Christians and Seljuk Muslims. But to a refugee tribe, it was good enough: grass for horses, streams for sheep, and the chance to fight for more. Your daily life among the Kayas would be simple, but relentless. You'd sleep under the curved roof of a yurt, its felt walls heavy with the smell of smoke and wool. Dawn would wake you not with alarm bells, but with neighing horses and bleating goats. Men would set out to pasture, while women spun wool, wove rugs, and tended to the food. Children learned early to ride, to pull a bow, and to carry themselves with the pride of nomads who believed they were heirs to conquerors. One thing stands out immediately. The horse is everything. You eat horse meat, you drink kumirs, fermented mare's milk, you fight from horseback, you measure wealth in herds. Even love and marriage often begin with horse riding competitions or displays of skill. In this way, Osman grew up in a world where the saddle was as natural as walking, where to be without a horse was to be naked. Yet this was no idyllic meadow life. The frontier was dangerous. Raiding was constant, and not just against Byzantines. Tribes clashed with tribes, beyliks with beyliks, over grazing rights, water and honor. One wrong move, one insult, one stolen sheep, and entire families might be uprooted. In the evenings, when the tribe gathered, you would hear stories of old battles, of Seljuk sultans who had once commanded vast armies, of ogres' forefathers who rode against Persians and Arabs, of faith carried like a sword into foreign lands. These stories were not bedtime fairy tales. They were the DNA of the tribe, lessons that taught loyalty, courage, and the conviction that the chaos had a destiny larger than mere survival. Now let's turn your eyes to Osman himself. Born around 2058, Osman grew up in this crucible of steppe tradition and frontier hardship. Picture a boy with sharp eyes, dark hair tied back, and a restlessness in his step. He trained with the bow, the spear, the sword, and by his teens could match older warriors in horse riding and wrestling. In this culture, strength wasn't a hobby, it was a language, one you had to speak fluently if you wanted respect. But alongside strength, Osman absorbed something else: the art of leadership. His father Ertugrul was not just a warrior, but a mediator. He kept peace with Seljuk governors when it was wise, fought Byzantines when it was necessary, and gave his tribe a sense of stability in unstable times. Osman learned this balancing act from an early age. You, listening now, might ask, why does this matter? Aren't all nomadic chiefs just warrior leaders? But here's the thing. Osman's genius wasn't only in swinging a sword. Many could do that. His gift was in binding people together, in making warriors believe they fought not only for loot but for destiny. Take for example the tribe's relationship with Islam. The Kalnis were devout Muslims. Though their Islam was coloured by the frontier, they followed dervishes and holy men, mystics who mixed faith with charisma. Imagine a wandering Sufi sheikh, stepping into the camp, his robe dusty, his eyes burning with conviction, telling Osman's tribe that their struggle against Byzantines wasn't just survival, it was a holy mission. This fusion of tribal loyalty, warrior culture and religious fervour gave Osman a foundation sturdier than mere raiding. And let's not forget the role of family alliances. Osman's marriage to Malmun Hatun, sometimes remembered as the daughter of a powerful neighbouring bey, wasn't just about love, it was about stitching together support networks. In the tribal world, marriages were political treaties, a way to secure allies, pasture and legitimacy. Look closer at the tent where the bey holds council. Osman, still young, sits near his father's side, listening as older warriors argue about where to raid next, which Seljuk governor to appease, and which Byzantine village might be vulnerable. He speaks rarely, but when he does, the older men pause. His words are not wild boasts, but careful, considered ideas. Already, people see a spark. It's also worth noting how fragile all this is. The Kayas are not a mighty empire. They're a modest tribe perched between hungry wolves. A wrong raid could spark retaliation from Byzantium. A wrong word could anger the Seljuks. A wrong alliance could trigger a tribal feud. And yet, within this precarious space, Osman's roots deepen, nourished by hardship and opportunity. Imagine standing outside at night. The air is cold, stars sharp in the sky. Osman, a boy now stepping into manhood, looks westward. Beyond the hills lies Byzantine land, villages, fortresses, and cities. To most, they're neighbours or enemies. To Osman, they are a horizon waiting to be crossed. Here's where the cheeky modern aside slips in. If you've ever played a strategy game and started with just a small tribe in a corner of the map, staring nervously at larger powers, you already know Osman's position. The difference is, You don't get a restart campaign button if the Mongols burn your village. The K tribe's roots, its stories, its horses, its faith. These are the soil out of which Osman grows. And soon this young man will have to step beyond being Ertuğrul's son and prove that he can lead not only the Kayis, but also anyone willing to follow the dream he begins to whisper. For now though, you're still on the step with them, drinking warm milk, pulling your cloak tighter against the night air, and wondering if this restless boy named Osman might someday reshape the world. Spoiler alert, yes, he will. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had once been the powerhouse of Anatolia, stretching across valleys and mountains with glittering cities like Konya at its heart. But by the time you step into this moment with Osman's people, the Seljuks are a shadow of their former selves. Their decline isn't a whisper anymore. It's a thud, a collapse you can feel under your feet like rotten floorboards giving way. The breaking point came in 1243 at the Battle of Kozadar, where the Seljuks faced the Mongols. Picture it, banners flapping, cavalry charging, dust boiling up from hooves, and then total disaster. The Mongols smashed the Seljuk army so decisively that afterward the sultans became little more than puppets. They paid tribute, obeyed Mongol commands, and lost their grip on authority. From that moment the sultanate was like a falcon with clipped wings. It still looked like a bird, but it would never fly again. Fast forward to Osman's youth, and you find a land without a central power to enforce order. Anatolia becomes a mosaic of little fiefdoms, beyliks each ruled by ambitious chieftains. Imagine looking at a map. Instead of one smooth colour across the land, it's a patchwork quilt stitched badly, with seams tearing apart. Karaman in the south, Jermian in the west, Ardin and Menteşe along the coast, and Osman's modest Kayu domain in Surgut. Everyone is armed, everyone is nervous, and everyone is looking for a chance to take more. You, walking through this land, would feel the insecurity in every village. Markets aren't bustling with long caravans anymore. Trade routes have shriveled under Mongol taxation and bandit raids. Farmers sow cautiously, wondering whether the harvest will be stolen by a passing warband. Walls of towns are patched, sometimes with wood instead of stone, because no one has the resources to rebuild properly. It's survival mode everywhere. The Mongols themselves are a constant shadow. Though they don't directly occupy every corner, their presence looms like a tax collector at the door. The Ilkhanate in Persia keeps an eye on Anatolia, demanding tribute, reminding the Seljuks, and by extension, every bey that they're in charge. Seljuk sultans in Konya are figureheads, sometimes even deposed or replaced at Mongol whim. So when Osman looks east, he doesn't see a strong overlord to fear, he sees a hollow throne. And this hollow throne is important, because in a world without strong central power, little chiefs like Osman suddenly have room to grow. It's like when a tree falls in the forest. Sunlight pours into the gap, and saplings scramble upward. Osman is one of those saplings, but unlike many others, he will grow into a forest giant. But first, let's get you into the rhythm of life in this fractured land. Picture yourself joining a caravan, travelling west. You pass through regions where one bey controls a fortress, then another rules a valley. Each demands a toll, each flies his banner, each claims loyalty to the Seljuk Sultan, but in reality acts independently. You'd notice that loyalty to the Seljuks is more of a polite fiction. People nod and say, yes, yes, the Sultan rules us, while secretly following their local bey's orders. The Mongols don't care, as long as tribute flows. By the time you arrive near Surgut, the situation feels different. Here, the Byzantine frontier presses close. The Seljuks can't protect it, the Mongols don't bother with it, and the Byzantines are too weak to reclaim it. It's like no man's land, fertile ground for ambitious leaders. Osman looks at this frontier not as a danger, but as an invitation. Let's pause here for a reality check. You probably won't survive this frontier shuffle. Imagine you're a farmer. Today you pay taxes to a Seljuk governor, tomorrow raiders burn your field, next week a bey's troops demand loyalty. By the end of the season you might have given the same sheep 3 times to 3 different masters. Stressful doesn't even begin to cover it. And yet, this chaos creates opportunity. Enterprising leaders can gather warriors with promises of loot and pasture. Dervishes, wandering mystics, preach that the frontier is a place for holy struggle. Gaza, fight the Byzantines, they say, and you fight for God. That rhetoric is powerful, and Osman, growing into leadership, knows how to harness it. The Seljuks' weakness also means no one stops tribal migrations. So you find Turkic tribes pushing further west, settling near valleys and rivers once firmly Byzantine. These movements slowly change the demographics. Turkish-speaking Muslim communities grow, where once Greek-speaking Christians dominated. Osman's tribe, the Kayas, are part of this slow wave, one of many, but soon they'll become the leading edge. Another detail you'd notice, Seljuk cities like Konya or Kayseri are still alive but quieter. Their bazaars aren't the humming centres they once were. Artisans still carve wood and weave carpets. Scholars still teach in madrasas, but the sense of grandeur is gone. The Seljuks are fading, and the Beyleks know it. This is why Osman, even as a small bey, can dream bigger. The old order is collapsing, and nobody is strong enough to stop him from building a new one. Think of it like this. If the Seljuks were a big tree cut down by Mongol axes, Osman is the sprout growing from the stump. The soil is still fertile, the roots are deep, but the trunk is gone. You don't need to be a genius to see opportunity, but you do need to be bold enough to grab it. Osman was bold. You can almost hear conversations among his men around the campfires. Someone says, "The Sultan in Konya grows weaker every day." Another adds, "The Byzantines can't defend their forts. Their soldiers are underpaid, and their walls are crumbling." And then someone, maybe Osman himself, leans forward and says, "So why not us? Why not now?" That's the energy in the air. The fall of the Seljuks isn't just the end of a state, it's the beginning of a frontier where ambition is the only law. And Osman, shaped by his tribal roots and this chaotic environment, is exactly the kind of leader who can seize it. So here you are, standing in a world where an empire has fallen. The Mongols loom in the background, and little warlords carve pieces of land like kids tearing bread. Most will be forgotten, swallowed by stronger neighbours, but one of them, will plant a seed that grows into something so vast it will outlive all its rivals and reshape history itself. Osman's inheritance begins not with trumpets and ceremonies, but with the simple passing of a tent, a sword, and the trust of his people. Around 121, when his father Ertugrul Bey died, the leadership of the modest Kayi tribe fell to Osman. Imagine it, a tribe of perhaps 400 tents, a few thousand souls at most, scattered across the hills and valleys around Sugut and Domaniche. This wasn't an empire, not even close. It was a scrap of land on the very edge of Anatolia, pressed between the Byzantine frontier and the uncertain remnants of Seljuk power. If you're picturing a solemn funeral, you wouldn't be wrong. Ertugrul's body, wrapped in cloth, laid to rest with prayers murmured by dervishes, the tribe gathered with bowed heads. But the real ceremony wasn't in the burial, it was in what came after. The warriors, elders and holy men of the Kayyiho tribe turned their eyes to Osman. In this world, leadership wasn't automatically inherited like in a neat family monarchy. It had to be accepted, proven and tested, and Osman, the youngest son, had to show that he was worthy. Here's the kicker. He did. His reputation for bravery in raids, his sharp mind in council, and his ability to inspire confidence made the elders nod in agreement. Step into that council tent with me. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, rugs cushioning the ground, men with long moustaches and weathered faces argue in low voices. Some say we should follow Gunduz, Osman's older brother. Others mutter, no, Osman is the one who has the fire. Finally, the decision turns. The tribe raises Osman, young but already seasoned by the frontier, as their bey. Your modern brain might ask, what exactly did he inherit? Was it land, wealth, castles? Nope. Osman inherited responsibility and potential. His realm was so good, a grazing land granted to his father by the Seljuks decades earlier. It was a frontier outpost strategically placed but vulnerable, where raids across the Byzantine border were as common as market days. Osman inherited warriors whose loyalty was rooted in kinship and respect. not in fixed salaries or feudal contracts, and he inherited a dream, though faint at first, that this tiny principality could grow. Now imagine waking up in Osman's shoes. You're the leader of a tribe that looks to you for food, pasture, and protection. Your men are restless. They want raids and booty. Your dervishes and holy men whisper of spreading the faith into Byzantine lands. Your neighbors, other Turkish beyliks, watch you with suspicion. And over it all, the Seljuk Sultan in Konya still claims authority, though his voice is faint. Osman makes his first moves cautiously. He consolidates his base in Seljuk. This is no bustling city, more like a fortified village with a small garrison, markets where Greek and Turkish farmers trade side by side, and fields where oxen plough under the wary eyes of watchmen. Osman ensures his people feel secure here. Herds graze under guard, markets thrive without constant raids. For a frontier tribe, stability is half the battle. But Osman doesn't just keep the peace, he also builds prestige through raiding. On horseback, he leads his ghazies across the border, striking at Byzantine villages and forts. These aren't random attacks. Each raid is both survival and strategy. Steal cattle to feed the tribe, capture supplies to keep warriors loyal, and weaken Byzantine hold on the frontier. Every successful raid adds to Osman's reputation as a bey worth following. Let's not forget the spiritual dimension. Around Osman, dervishes gather, men like Sheikh Adibali, the Sufi mystic whose influence becomes legendary. In your modern eyes, this might seem like having a spiritual advisor, but on the frontier, it was much. Dervishes blessed raids, preached unity, and gave Osman's wars a sense of holy purpose. Instead of mere cattle theft, these raids became Gaza, holy struggle. That framing drew not only Osman's tribe, but also outsiders, warriors from other clans, wanderers with no land, even runaway peasants. All began to drift into Osman's orbit, attracted by the promise of faith, plunder, and leadership. This is where inheritance shifts into creation. Osman didn't just inherit a tribe, he began to transform it into something larger. Leadership on the frontier was always fragile. Fail one raid, lose one battle, and your warriors might abandon you. But Osman showed consistency. Victories, fairness in dividing spoils, generosity to allies, respect for holy men, all of these built loyalty. Now picture the symbolic side of his inheritance. Stories tell us that Osman carried the sword of his father, a simple curved blade, not yet the ornate sword of Osman that would later symbolize the Sultanate. In the rough wooden grip of that sword lay not just iron but legitimacy. Each new raid sharpened it, each new alliance strengthened it. Osman's warriors began to say, "This man leads us not just for today, but perhaps for generations." Meanwhile, across the border, the Byzantines took notice. Farmers cursed his name, garrisons reported his raids, and local commanders sent pleas to Constantinople. But the Byzantine emperors, strapped for resources and distracted by other threats, often ignored the frontier. That neglect gave Osman room to grow. Back home in Seljuk, life under Osman began to change. The tribe felt safer, more prosperous. Traders came through without fear of being robbed. Dervishes preached that Osman's leadership was part of divine destiny, and Osman himself, always careful, built bonds through marriage. His union with Molhun Hatun tied him to other powerful clans, strengthening his base. You, sitting by the fire in his camp, would notice something shifting. Osman isn't just a young man who inherited his father's tents. He's becoming something else, a leader with a vision that stretches beyond grazing lands and petty raids. The elders speak of him with respect, the young warriors with excitement, the holy men with reverence. Of course, this isn't a fairy tale. Osman's inheritance also comes with danger. Neighboring beyliks may resent his rise. The Byzantines won't ignore him forever, and the Mongols, though distant, still cast long shadows. But here's the truth. Osman doesn't just hold what he's been given, he's preparing to build on it. So when you step into the council tent again and see him seated at the head, listening carefully, speaking decisively, you realize something. This isn't just inheritance, it's ignition. The flame of leadership, lit by his father's hand, is now burning in him. and that flame, flickering in a small frontier tent, will one day blaze across continents. Life on the frontier was a strange balance of the ordinary and the extraordinary, the daily grind of survival mixed with the constant thrum of danger and opportunity. If you were living under Osman's rule in Surgut, you would quickly learn that your days unfolded according to rhythms older than memory and harsher than comfort. At sunrise, the camp stirred awake. Smoke curled up from hearth fires as women stirred pots of wheat porridge or stewed mutton left over from the night before. Children tumbled out of felt tents yawning, rubbing their eyes with hands still sticky from yesterday's figs, and immediately set to work. No lazy mornings here. Boys fetched water, girls tended goats, elders barked instructions, and everyone knew that every hand mattered. Step outside and you'd hear the mingling of sounds, the metallic scrape of swords being sharpened, the deep groaning of oxen hitched to carts, the impatient snorts of horses stamping their hooves on the cold ground. If you stood still long enough, the scent of leather, sweat and smoke would cling to your clothes like a second skin. This was the life of Osman's followers, part herders, part raiders, part holy warriors. They called themselves Ghazis, men of faith and frontier struggle. In reality, you might call them opportunists with prayer beads. Their raids into Byzantine territory weren't just about spreading religion. They were about filling bellies and strengthening pride. Faith sanctified hunger. Hunger demanded faith. It was a cycle, and Osman understood it perfectly. Picture a young Ghazi sitting by the fire at night. He boasts of the raid he went on last week, how he and his comrades crossed the river under cover of darkness, snatched cattle from a Byzantine farmstead, and rode home laughing as flames licked the barn roofs. Everyone cheers, not just because of the loot, but because such stories kept morale high. Each raid was proof that God favored Osman's band. Each successful return whispered, "We are chosen." But raids were only part of life. During quieter weeks, the Ghazis tended fields and herds, repaired weapons, and trained. Training was constant. Bows were strung and unstrung, arrows fletched with goose feathers, swords polished until they gleamed. Wrestling was a favorite pastime. Men grappling in dusty clearings, muscles straining, cheers erupting from the onlookers. These contests weren't just sport, they were preparation for real combat, a way to harden bodies and spirits. Faith bound this community as much as fighting. Dervishes, wandering mystics, roamed freely among the tents. One such man, Sheikh Edab Ali, became especially important to Osman. Imagine Edab Ali seated in his modest lodge, a simple wooden structure perfumed with incense. His voice is calm, his beard white, his eyes carrying the weight of devotion. He preaches patience, justice, and the inevitability of destiny. To the warriors, he is a source of spiritual legitimacy. To Osman, he becomes both mentor and father-in-law, tying the Bey's political and spiritual authority together. In fact, Edab Ali's influence cannot be overstated. The Ghazis may love plunder, but they also crave meaning. Raiding under Osman's banner is one thing. Raiding with Edab Ali's blessing transforms it into something divine. When Osman rides into battle, his warriors believe they are not just chasing cattle, they are chasing paradise. The frontier lifestyle also meant mixing with other peoples. Seljuks sat on a cultural crossroads. Markets saw Greek-speaking farmers selling olives beside Turkish herders offering wool. Armenian craftsmen repaired saddles, while Persian traders hawked spices. If you listened carefully in the market, you'd hear 4 or 5 languages at once, all competing over the price of a goat. For Osman's tribe, this diversity was a blessing and a curse. It offered trade and exchange, but it also brought spies, rivalries, and disputes. And yet, amid all this, a sense of identity was taking shape. The Kayis, once just another wandering clan, began to see themselves as more. Osman cultivated this identity carefully. He divided loot fairly, never forgetting to reward even the lowliest warrior. He invited dervishes into his council, ensuring that every decision carried the weight of faith. He forged marriages and alliances, weaving his small tribe into a wider network of loyalties. Of course, frontier life wasn't all noble struggles and stirring speeches. Let's be honest, it could be grim. Winters were bitter. snow piling against the tents, sheep freezing in their pens, children coughing with little medicine to help them. Summers could be brutal too, with the sun scorching the plains until pastures turned yellow and cracked. Famine was never far away. Sometimes the difference between survival and starvation came down to the success of one raid. Reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this world unless you were very tough or very lucky. For every warrior who returned triumphant with loot, another fell in some nameless skirmish and was buried quickly under a mound of stones. Frontier life didn't waste time on memorials. Grief was swallowed quickly, because tomorrow brought new dangers. But here's the twist. It was precisely this harshness that made Osman's people resilient. They lived close to hunger, close to death, but also close to hope. Every successful raid, every prayer answered, every birth in the camp was proof that they were enduring, and enduring, in this world, was the first step toward greatness. By night, around campfires, stories flowed. Some spoke of Ertuğrul's loyalty to the Seljuks, others whispered of Osman's growing reputation. Dervishes told tales of visions, of dreams in which Osman's star rose high above the horizon. These weren't idle fantasies, they were the seeds of myth, the beginnings of a narrative that would turn Osman from a man into a founder. Meanwhile, Osman himself balanced his days between governance and action. He listened to disputes among his people, whose goats trampled, whose fields, whose sons quarreled during wrestling. Justice mattered. A leader who ignored small grievances lost big loyalty. Osman understood this, settling quarrels with fairness, sometimes with humor, always with authority. Then when the sun set and the warriors gathered, he rode with them. He didn't sit in a tent while others risked their lives. He fought at the front, his sword flashing, his shouts carrying over the clash of steel. That's how loyalty was cemented, not with coins, but with shared risk. And you, standing in this frontier world, would sense the energy building. This isn't just a tribe living hand to mouth anymore. It's a community shaping into something sharper, more cohesive. The Ghazis are restless, the dervishes are inspired, the farmers are loyal, and Osman is at the center pulling it all together. Frontier life, harsh and uncertain, is forging something new. You don't see it yet, not fully, but history is stirring here. A small band of warriors on the edge of empires is beginning to imagine themselves as more than survivors. They are becoming the nucleus of a state, and Osman, inheritor of hardship, rider of raids, listener of dervishes, is slowly stepping into the role of founder. The Byzantine borderlands of Bithynia were a patchwork of ruins and resilience, a place where the empire's bones still stood, but its flesh had withered. If you, as one of Osman's Ghazis, rode westward from Surgut, the landscape would tell you everything. Abandoned farms choked with weeds, crumbling watchtowers, and half-deserted villages where chickens outnumbered people. This was the land the Byzantines still claimed but could no longer truly hold. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1200s, and the Byzantine Empire is staggering like an old man clutching a cane that keeps slipping. Constantinople had only been reclaimed from the Latin Crusaders in 1261, but the glory of the past was gone. The emperors of the Palaiologos dynasty ruled more in name than reality. Their treasury was empty, their soldiers unpaid, and their borders bleeding. Bithynia, the fertile region along the Sea of Marmara, dotted with towns like Bursa, Nicaea, Iznik, and Nicomedia, Izmit, was still rich in soil and trade routes, but its defences had thinned to a thread. From your saddle, you'd see the contrasts. On one hill, grapevines sprawled in neat rows, tended by weary Greek farmers whose backs bent like reeds in the wind. On another hill, the blackened shells of houses marked where raiders had struck years before and never been replaced. Fortresses still crowned ridges, but their stones were cracked, their garrisons thin, often no more than a handful of underpaid soldiers whose armor was patched with leather straps and whose morale sagged like wet cloth. For Osman, this was opportunity laid out like a banquet. The Seljuks to the east were collapsing under Mongol pressure. Neighbouring Bialiks were busy fighting each other. But here, to the west, lay an empire too weak to defend itself, yet too proud to admit it. If you were in Osman's position, wouldn't you feel the same tug? The Byzantine peasants along the frontier lived in a strange twilight. They owed taxes to Constantinople, but often their coins never reached the capital. Local lords, pronoi holders, men granted land in exchange for military service, collected dues, but many of these lords barely lifted a finger when raids came. So the farmers did what farmers always do. They prayed for peace, bribed whoever passed by, and tried to keep their families fed. Some, tired of Byzantine neglect, even welcomed Turkish beys who promised lower taxes and safer pastures. Imagine riding into one of these villages at dawn. Chickens scatter, dogs bark, and the peasants freeze, not knowing whether you come as raiders or protectors. If you're Osman, you understand the power of perception. Sometimes his men raided brutally, taking livestock, burning storehouses, but other times he offered protection in exchange for loyalty. Over time, many villagers began quietly to prefer his banner to that of a distant emperor. That's how borders shift, not just with swords, but with the slow erosion of faith in the old order. Still, make no mistake, this frontier was violent. Small skirmishes erupted constantly. A band of Turkish Ghazis might ambush a Byzantine patrol in a narrow pass. Byzantine soldiers might retaliate by torching a Turkish herding camp. It was tit-for-tat warfare, rarely decisive but endlessly draining. For Osman, every raid, every clash was both a risk and an advertisement. A successful raid meant loot, prestige, and new followers. A failed raid could mean death or desertion. Now, think about the strategic geography. Bithynia wasn't just fertile farmland, it was the doorway to the Byzantine heartland. From towns like Bursa, the roads led straight to the Sea of Marmara, and from there to Constantinople itself. Control Bithynia, and you controlled the land routes, linking Europe and Asia. Osman, perhaps without realizing the full scope, was planting his flag at the hinge of empires. Here's a reality check. If you were a Byzantine commander stationed in a small frontier fort, your job sucked. You were underpaid, your soldiers drank more than they drilled, and you had no hope of reinforcement. You watched from your crumbling walls as Osman's men grew bolder, riding past with banners fluttering, sometimes taunting you from a distance. You sent messages to Constantinople begging for aid, but none came. Sooner or later you knew your fort would fall, not in some grand siege, but one night when a wooden gate splintered under an axe. Osman's warriors thrived in this environment. They were lighter, faster, more motivated than their Byzantine foes. They didn't wait for orders from a distant capital. They rode when Osman said ride, and they believed every raid was sanctified. Plus, they had the advantage of mobility. Unlike the Byzantines, tied to fixed garrisons, Osman's men moved like smoke. But the borderlands weren't just about war. They were also about mingling. Greek and Turkish communities rubbed shoulders in markets. Marriages, sometimes consensual, sometimes forced, bridged the divide. Trade continued, because even enemies need olive oil, grain and wool. If you strolled through a frontier bazaar, you might hear Greek housewives haggling with Turkish herders over cheese, while a dervish muttered prayers nearby and a Byzantine tax collector tried not to get stabbed. The border was porous, messy, alive, and this messy coexistence actually helped Osman. It blurred lines, making it easier for him to slip into the cracks of Byzantine control. Some villagers paid tribute to him quietly, while still pretending loyalty to Constantinople. Others hedged their bets, giving supplies to both sides. Over time, Osman's influence seeped like water into these cracks, undermining Byzantine authority from below. One of the ironies here is that the Byzantines still saw themselves as the heirs of Rome, rulers of a universal empire. But on the ground in Bithynia, they were just another faction competing with Osman. When your local lord can't protect you, the idea of Rome doesn't mean much. Osman, with his horsemen and his sense of divine mission, was more real than the emperor in distant Constantinople. You, riding beside Osman in this period, would sense his growing confidence. Every raid across the border wasn't just about plunder. It was a rehearsal for something bigger. He studied the weaknesses of Byzantine forts, learned which villages could be persuaded rather than destroyed, and built his reputation as a man of both sword and strategy. Let's throw in a modern aside here. If this were a video game, Osman's map awareness would be through the roof. He knew when to strike, when to pull back, and when to negotiate. He wasn't playing checkers on the frontier, he was playing chess. 3 moves ahead, while the Byzantines barely knew what board they were on. But remember, none of this was inevitable. The borderlands were littered with other beys who tried and failed. What made Osman stand out was the way he combined brutality with pragmatism, faith with flexibility. He could burn a village one week and welcome another into his fold the next. He could swing a sword at the front of his warriors, then sit cross-legged in a dervish's lodge seeking counsel. So here you are, in the fractured Byzantine borderlands of Bithynia. You smell the smoke of raided villages, hear the prayers of dervishes, see the weary eyes of farmers who no longer trust their emperor, and at the center of it all, you watch Osman riding, his gaze fixed westward, seeing not ruins but a horizon of possibility. The border is weak, the empire is brittle, and Osman, son of Ertugrul, is ready to carve his story into the cracks of Byzantium. The first battles and raids of Osman's career were not grand spectacles with thousands of men clashing beneath banners. It was frontier warfare, small, sharp and personal. If you were there, you'd see it unfold more like a series of ambushes, night strikes and sudden rushes on crumbling villages, rather than the kind of formal campaigns you read about in glossy chronicles. And yet, these early skirmishes were the stones on which Osman built his house. Each raid strengthened his reputation, fed his tribe, and carved out space in a land too contested for weakness. Picture yourself riding out with Osman's men on one of these first raids. It's night, and the moon hangs thin over the plains. You're wrapped in a wool cloak, breath clouding in the cold. The horses are restless but quiet, their hooves muffled by leather wrappings to keep from clattering against stones. Osman rides at the front, bow slung across his back, spear in hand. His men whisper prayers under their breath, lips moving around Quranic verses, but you can also feel their hunger for loot. Faith and survival are woven tightly here. You don't separate them, you don't question them. The target? A Byzantine hamlet on the edge of the Sakarya River. Farmers sleep, unaware that raiders are slipping closer with each hoofbeat. Suddenly, at Osman's signal, the men erupt forward. Dogs bark, women scream. The night fills with chaos. Cattle are driven out, storehouses cracked open, coins and grain seized. Fires catch on thatched roofs. And then, just as quickly, Osman's men vanish back into the darkness, leaving behind confusion, smoke and broken fences. By dawn they are gone, their camp buzzing with excitement. The spoils are divided. This was the formula. Strike quickly, vanish before reinforcements arrive, and return home with wealth and stories. Each success brought more warriors to Osman's side. Young men from neighboring tribes, tired of chiefs who were too cautious or too weak, drifted into his camp. Ride with Osman, they said, and you ride with fortune. But don't think these raids were just smash and grab. Osman understood something deeper. Perception mattered. After a raid, he distributed loot fairly. Even the poorest warrior received a share. That fairness built loyalty. When disputes arose, he mediated firmly, but with humor, ensuring no grudges festered. Slowly, Osman's reputation grew, not only as a bold raider, but as a just leader. The Byzantines, meanwhile, began to feel the sting. Local commanders in Bithynia sent frantic reports to Constantinople. Turks raid our villages, burn our fields, and mock our soldiers. But the emperor had bigger problems. Civil wars simmered, the treasury was empty, and mercenaries demanded pay the empire couldn't provide. Reinforcements rarely came, so the frontier towns and forts of Bithynia were left to fend for themselves. Now imagine being a Byzantine farmer on this frontier. Your lord promises protection, but the walls of the local fort crumble and the garrison numbers fewer than 50. You've seen Turkish raiders crest the hills before, their arrows darkening the sky, and you know your tax money won't save you. Some farmers fled inland. Others tried to strike quiet deals with men like Osman, offering tribute in exchange for safety. And each time a village shifted allegiance, however quietly, Osman's influence spread. The raids also taught Osman invaluable lessons. He learned the lay of the land, the rivers, valleys, and forest trails where ambushes worked best. He studied Byzantine defenses, noting which towers were neglected, which roads unguarded. He discovered that a single decisive strike at harvest time could cripple a region's food supply. These weren't just raids anymore, they were the beginnings of strategy. One story often repeated speaks of the capture of Karakohisar, a small but symbolic Byzantine fortress near Eskişehir. Accounts differ, but the essence is this. Osman's men, through either siege or sudden assault, managed to take the fort around 128. For the first time, he had more than just spoils. He had a permanent base of stone and mortar. From Karakohisar, raids could be launched deeper into Byzantine lands, and the symbolism was huge. A Turkish bey had taken a Byzantine stronghold and held it. That single act broadcasted across the frontier. Osman was no longer just a raider, he was a rising power. Life in Karakohisar changed too. Greek inhabitants were allowed to stay under Osman's rule, paying taxes but enjoying greater stability than before. This approach, conquest blended with tolerance, would become a hallmark of Ottoman expansion, and you can imagine the conversations in Byzantine villages nearby. The Turks? They're harsh. Yes, but Osman lets us farm in peace. Our emperor in Constantinople doesn't even send soldiers. Such whispers eroded imperial loyalty faster than Osman's arrows ever could. Let's add a modern wink here. If you've ever played a strategy game, you know the moment when your faction upgrades from a wooden camp to a stone fortress. That's Karakohisar for Osman. Suddenly, he wasn't just surviving on raids. He had infrastructure, permanence, and a symbol that said, "I am here to stay." Of course, not every raid succeeded. Sometimes Byzantine defenders ambushed Osman's men. Sometimes neighbouring beyliks grew jealous and clashed with him. But even setbacks served as lessons. Osman proved remarkably resilient, bouncing back quickly, never letting a loss fester into decline. His charisma kept men loyal, his faith gave them purpose, and his fairness held the community together. The rhythm of these years was relentless. Raid, return, celebrate, plan again. Each cycle strengthened Osman's authority. The Ghazis came to believe they were part of something larger than plunder, a movement, even destiny. The Byzantines, once masters of these lands, were reduced to watching their frontiers crumble, powerless to stop the tide. You, sitting by the fire after one of these raids, would feel the energy in the air. Warriors laugh, recounting their exploits, drinking fermented mare's milk. Dervishes chant blessings, reminding everyone that their struggle is holy. Children chase each other between tents, wearing scraps of Byzantine cloth taken as trophies, and Osman, seated at the center, listens, smiles, and plans. These first battles and raids may look small on the grand stage of history, but they were the foundation stones of empire. Without them, Osman would be just another forgotten bey on the frontier. With them, he became the man whose banner others sought, whose raids were legend, whose vision began to stretch beyond the horizon. And the Byzantines, they were beginning to realize that what they faced wasn't just another raid, it was the rise of something permanent, something dangerous, something that would one day knock on the gates of their greatest city. The formation of a state does not happen with the stroke of a pen or the sudden planting of a flag. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, through hundreds of small choices, victories and alliances. With Osman, you begin to see that shift in these years. What had started as a loose band of warriors bound by kinship and opportunity began to take on the shape of something sturdier. You can almost hear the ground settling under your feet, the foundations of a house being laid stone by stone. By now, Osman had proven himself more than a raider. The capture of Karakohisar and his repeated victories against Byzantine garrisons signaled permanence. But permanence requires more than swords. If you were living in Seljuk during this time, you would notice that Osman's tent was no longer just a chieftain's yurt. It was turning into a court. Councils were held regularly, disputes settled formally, and warriors came not only to raid but to swear lasting allegiance. Osman was transforming from a bey of tents to the nucleus of a principality. The secret? He knew how to attract people. Warriors flocked to him, drawn by his fairness and success. Dervishes and holy men rallied to his banner, convinced that he carried divine favor. Farmers and craftsmen, weary of Byzantine neglect, accepted his rule because it offered stability. Every new raid, every new fortress, added to his prestige. But it was his ability to bind these different groups together that truly set him apart. Picture the scene in Osman's camp one evening. A dervish sits cross-legged, chanting verses, his voice carrying like smoke over the tents. Beside him, a grizzled Ghazi sharpens his sword, nodding along, believing that both his blade and the holy man's words are part of the same struggle. Across the fire, a Greek blacksmith, once loyal to Byzantium, now hammers out arrowheads for Osman's men, content that under this new buy he can work without his shop being burned in the next raid. This is the alchemy of state building, disparate people drawn together by charisma, opportunity, and the promise of order. One of Osman's greatest strokes of genius was how he blended religious legitimacy with practical governance. Take Sheikh Edebali, for example. The Sheikh's influence was enormous, not only as Osman's mentor but later as his father-in-law through Osman's marriage to Edebali's daughter, Bala Hatun. This alliance fused political power with spiritual authority. Every time Osman acted with Edebali's blessing, it wasn't just Osman the warlord making a decision, it was Osman the chosen leader of a divinely sanctioned cause. For his followers, that mattered. And Osman knew how to use symbols. The Friday sermon, the khutbah, is a powerful declaration of sovereignty in Islamic tradition. When the khutbah was read in Osman's name at Karakasar, it was more than a religious service. It was a political statement. It meant Osman was not just a tribal chief anymore. He was a ruler, claiming legitimacy before God and men. That single act told everyone on the frontier, Osman is building something larger than himself. Let's not romanticize this too much though. Forming a state on the frontier wasn't clean or gentle. There were rival beyliks nearby, jealous of Osman's rise. Clashes with other Turkish tribes were frequent, as everyone scrambled for grazing land and plunder routes. Diplomacy was often as sharp as the sword. Osman sometimes allied with neighbors, sometimes fought them, depending on what served survival. A wrong step could mean disaster. But Osman's adaptability kept him ahead. He was ruthless when necessary, patient when wise, and always alert to opportunity. Economics, too, played a role. Raids provided immediate wealth, but a state needs more than stolen cattle. Osman encouraged trade in his territory. Markets at Seljuk and Karakhisar grew busier. Merchants felt safer under his protection than under the crumbling Byzantines. Taxation emerged. Not yet a sophisticated system, but enough to fund warriors and keep the machinery of leadership running. Slowly, Osman's people began to expect not just protection, but administration. If you looked around at the time, you might not yet call it an empire. It was still a fragile collection of villages, forts, and warriors, held together by one man's leadership. But you'd feel the difference. Osman's camp was no longer a place you passed through. It was a center of gravity pulling people in, and once pulled in, they rarely left. You'd also notice Osman's careful treatment of conquered populations. Unlike some raiders who slaughtered or enslaved indiscriminately, Osman often allowed local Christians to remain, provided they paid taxes and acknowledged his rule. This policy was practical, not sentimental. It meant continuity of farming, stable food supplies, and fewer rebellions. But it also gave his principality a reputation for relative tolerance, making it easier to attract new subjects. Think of it like this. While other frontier chiefs were playing short-term games, Osman was laying down rules that hinted at a long-term vision. His people weren't just surviving raid to raid anymore, they were beginning to believe they belonged to something with a future. Now, for a bit of cheeky modern perspective, imagine Osman as the startup founder of his day. While other chiefs were still hustling on the side, Osman was scaling up, turning a scrappy band into an organization with systems, branding, Hello Ghazi identity, and investment, both spiritual and economic. If you worked for him, you weren't just another mercenary, you were part of a movement with stock in destiny. By the end of this phase, Osman's principality had the key ingredients of a state: a leader with charisma and legitimacy, a core of loyal warriors bound by faith and fairness, territory anchored by fortresses like Karakhisar and towns like Seljuk, a population willing to pay taxes in exchange for protection, a vision, shaped by both raids and dreams, of expansion westward into Byzantine lands. You can feel the shift, can't you? The fires of the Ghazi camp are still burning. The raids are still constant, But there's something new in the air. This is no longer just a tribe passing through history. This is the birth of permanence. If you close your eyes here, you can almost hear the faint hum of an empire beginning. Not yet a roar, but steady, insistent, and unstoppable. The story of Osman would be incomplete without the tale that his followers and later chroniclers cherished most. The Dream of Osman. If you've been walking beside him through the dust of raids and the smoke of frontier fires, now you step into the stillness of a night when visions are said to speak louder than swords. The setting is the house of Sheikh Edebali, Osman's mentor and spiritual anchor. Picture it, a modest wooden lodge, lit by the flickering glow of oil lamps. Carpets cover the floor, the air smells of burning sandalwood, and outside you can hear the quiet murmurs of the town settling to sleep. Osman, still a young bee, is Edebali's guest. He's been welcomed into the Sheikh's home for counsel, prayers, perhaps simply for a night of peace away from the noise of camp life. That night, Osman dreams. And in that dream, legend tells us, a great tree rises from his chest. Its trunk grows tall and straight, its branches spreading wide until they cover the whole world. Its leaves stretch to the heavens, and beneath its shade flow mighty rivers that give life to countless people. Mountains bow before it, and cities rise beneath its shelter. This tree, they say, is the empire to come, the dynasty that will spring from Osman's blood and endure for centuries. When Osman wakes, he shares the dream with Sheikh Edebali. The Sheikh interprets it as a divine sign. From you, he says, shall rise a line of rulers whose power will spread across the earth, who will bring justice and dominion under God's will. The Sheikh then gives Osman his blessing, and in some accounts offers him his daughter Bala Hatun in marriage, thus joining spiritual authority with political leadership. Now pause for a moment. Did Osman really dream this vision exactly as told? Probably not. Legends are polished over time like stones in a river, but whether the dream happened in that way or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it. In a world where symbols were as powerful as swords, this dream became the charter of the Ottoman dynasty. Think of it from the perspective of Osman's warriors. They had followed him through hunger, raids, and skirmishes. They had seen his fairness and bravery, but now they had something more, proof, or at least a story, that their leader was chosen by destiny. To fight for Osman wasn't just to fight for loot, it was to fight for the future, to stand at the roots of the great tree that would one day cover the world. The dream also gave Osman legitimacy in a way no battle could. Many frontier bees claimed bravery, many won fortresses, but only Osman was said to have been blessed with a vision of empire, confirmed by the most respected dervish of the region. In an age when divine sanction mattered deeply, this was priceless. And let's be honest, dreams carry weight even now. Imagine your boss coming in one morning and saying, "I dreamed last night that this company will take over the world." You'd laugh, unless that boss was already winning every battle and building something real. Then you'd start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was true. Osman had the victories, the charisma, and now the dream. That combination made him magnetic. The symbolism of the tree is especially powerful. Trees endure, trees shelter, trees root themselves deep while stretching toward the heavens. For a nomadic people used to the fragility of tents and the uncertainty of pasture, the image of a tree offered stability, permanence, and destiny. It told Osman's people that they were no longer wanderers, they were the trunk of something vast and enduring. You, sitting in that lodge with Osman and Edebali, would feel the energy of that interpretation. The Sheikh's calm voice, Osman's thoughtful nods, the way the warriors outside murmured the story to one another. It was like watching the birth of a myth in real time. Myths aren't just stories, they are blueprints for identity. From this point forward, Osman's raids and conquests carried a different weight. They weren't random strikes anymore, they were steps toward fulfilling the dream. Every fortress taken, every village brought under his banner, every sermon read in his name was proof that the great tree was sprouting. His men fought harder because they believed their leader's success was written in the stars. But don't think Osman himself sat back smugly and let the dream do the work. He used it as fuel, but he kept fighting, planning, and leading. The dream wasn't a free pass, it was a responsibility. If destiny had chosen him, he had to live up to it. And in living up to it, he made the dream real. The dream also strengthened Osman's alliances. His marriage to Bala Hatun tied him permanently to Sheikh Edebali's spiritual authority. It sent a message. Osman was not just a sword arm of the Ghazis, he was the chosen son-in-law of the most respected sheikh in the region. That alliance brought not only legitimacy, but also new followers. For many who trusted Edebali now pledged themselves to Osman as well. Here's a cheeky modern aside. The Dream of Osman was basically the medieval equivalent of a killer brand logo, and a viral marketing campaign rolled into one. One story, one symbol, and suddenly Osman's startup wasn't just another frontier outfit. It was the destined empire in the making, and honestly, it worked. So when you walk through Osman's camp after the dream, you notice a difference. The fires still burn, the warriors still wrestle, the horses still snort in the night, but the conversations have changed. They don't just talk about tomorrow's raid, they talk about the empire their children will see. They don't just boast of loot, they boast of being the roots of the tree. And as you listen, you realize something. Whether the dream was real or not, it has already become reality in their minds. And once people believe a story strongly enough, they will fight, bleed, and die to make it true. Osman had captured villages, forts, and loyalty before, but with the Dream of Osman, he captured something even more powerful: imagination. And imagination, once set on fire, is the surest weapon of all. Expansion into Bithynia was not a single campaign, but a gradual, grinding push like water seeping through cracks in rock until suddenly the rock splits. By the early 1300s, Osman's small principality had hardened into something stronger than a frontier tribe, and its gaze was firmly westward toward the Byzantine lands of Bithynia. If you mounted a horse and rode with Osman's warriors at this time, you would notice how systematic their efforts had become. These weren't random cattle raids anymore. The raids were coordinated, aimed at weakening Byzantine control of roads, forts, and fertile valleys. Each strike wasn't just about plunder, but about pressure-sapping Byzantine morale, disrupting harvests and forcing villagers to accept Osman's overlordship. The first targets were small fortresses. Imagine a squat Byzantine tower rising from a hilltop, walls crumbling but still intimidating. Osman's men would encircle it, cutting off supplies, harassing its garrison day after day. The defenders, poorly paid and far from Constantinople, often surrendered after weeks, sometimes after months. When they did, Osman rarely slaughtered them. Instead, he allowed many locals to remain, now under his tax system. This policy wasn't just mercy, it was strategy. Every time a garrison surrendered without massacre, news spread. Better to yield to Osman than to starve under neglectful emperors. One by one, forts fell. Sometimes by force, sometimes by negotiation, sometimes by outright bribery. In the chronicles, names flicker: Yalhisar, Bialechik, Yenişehir. Each conquest tightened Osman's grip on the region, expanding his base beyond Surgut and Karacahisar. You can almost picture a map with Byzantine red shrinking patch by patch, replaced by Osman's colours creeping steadily across valleys and rivers. Yenişehir became especially important. Taken around 131, it offered Osman a new headquarters closer to the heart of Bithynia. It was fertile, with water and farmland, and strategically placed between major Byzantine cities. From Yenişehir, Osman's warriors could strike deeper, faster. The move of his capital here marked a turning point. Osman was no longer just a raider on the border, he was a lord holding land in the Byzantine heartland itself. Let's pause and step into one of these conquests. It's dawn outside Yalhisar. Osman's men creep through misty fields, their armor light, bows strung. The fort's defenders stir sleepily, unaware. Suddenly a signal shouted takbir. The cry of Allahu Akbar erupts. Arrows rain down, ladders slam against walls, and Ghazis scramble upward, knives flashing. Within hours the gate crashes open. The defenders scatter. Osman rides in, his banner lifted high. Some villagers kneel, Some flee, some whisper that destiny has arrived. By nightfall, Yahisar is no longer Byzantine, it is Osman's. But this expansion wasn't just military. Diplomacy played its role. Osman built alliances with neighbouring beyliks when useful, sometimes marrying off family members to cement ties. He also welcomed outsiders into his fold, displaced Turks, runaway peasants, mercenaries who had grown tired of Byzantine arrears. His state was becoming a magnet for the discontented, and with each new conquest, Osman integrated rather than destroyed. Markets continued under his rule. Taxes were collected, but not extortionate. Christians often kept their land, paying jizya, a tax for non-Muslims, but otherwise living in relative peace. This pragmatism allowed Osman to expand his population base quickly. While the Byzantines drained loyalty with neglect, Osman gained it by offering stability. By 1301, the Byzantines finally realized the seriousness of the threat. Emperor Andronicus II sent a force to stop Osman near Nicaea. At the Battle of Baphius, Osman's men clashed with the Byzantine army. Though outnumbered, Osman's warriors fought fiercely, and the Byzantines, poorly organized, broke under pressure. The battle was small in scale but massive in symbolism. For the first time, Osman had defeated an imperial force in open combat. From then on, the Byzantines lost the initiative in Bithynia. Think about how that looked to Osman's followers. Before, they had raided villages and toppled forts, but now they had beaten the emperor's soldiers themselves. That victory sent waves of confidence through the Ghazis. Every raid afterward carried the echo of Baphius. We can defeat Byzantium. If you walked through Osman's camp after that battle, you would see the change. Warriors strutted with new pride, banners flew higher, and even dervishes spoke with more conviction. The dream of Osman wasn't just a story anymore, it was unfolding visibly. Osman's enemies, meanwhile, were dwindling. The Byzantines struggled to reinforce Bithynia. Other beyliks, instead of challenging him, often sought his alliance, recognizing his rising power. And the Mongols, busy with their own troubles further east, never intervened directly. The timing was perfect. A weak Byzantium, distracted Mongols, disunited neighbors. Osman thrived in the cracks of empires. Here's a modern aside for you. This phase of Osman's career was basically his early expansion level in a grand strategy game. He started with a single province, Surgut, and through careful play he gained forts, cities, and allies. And unlike so many other players on this crowded map, Osman avoided the trap of overreaching too soon. He grew steadily, sustainably, until he was too strong to be ignored. By the time Osman grew older, his realm stretched firmly into Bithynia. His warriors rode openly through lands that had once been securely Byzantine. His capital at Yenisheir thrived. His sons, especially Orhan, began to take on leadership roles in campaigns. The state had grown beyond one man's charisma. It had institutions, systems, and momentum. So if you're standing here in the early 1300s, looking west from Yenisheir, what do you see? You see Byzantine cities like Bursa and Nicaea still holding out, their walls tall and proud, their banners still flying. But you also see Osman's forces tightening around them, gnawing away at their countryside, cutting off supplies, waiting patiently. It's like watching a great tree's roots slowly split apart the stones around them. The Byzantines still look imposing, but deep down, you know the cracks are fatal. Expansion into Bithynia wasn't the blaze of a single campaign, it was the steady glow of years of raids, sieges, alliances, and settlements. It was Osman's genius. To turn a tribal band into a state, to turn raids into governance, to turn the dream of empire into the first outline of reality. And as night falls over Yenisheir, you hear Osman's warriors singing around their fires. Their voices rise into the dark, echoing across the fields, carrying with them the certainty that the tree from Osman's dream is already growing, its branches reaching westward, towards cities that will one day fall into its shade. The siege of Bursa begins not with a sudden clash of armies, but with silence, patience, and the tightening grip of Osman's growing principality. By the second decade of the 1300s, Osman's warriors had swept through much of Bithynia's countryside, cutting Byzantine control into isolated patches. Only the cities remained, tall, defiant, but surrounded. Among them, Bursa stood out. Fertile lands, rich markets, strategic location. Whoever held Bursa held the keys to the region. Picture the city at this time. Its walls, high and white, wrapped around a hill crowned with churches and palaces. Below stretched vineyards, olive groves, and streams running clear from the mountains. To the Byzantines, it was a proud frontier city. To Osman and his followers, it was the prize of prizes. From Yenişehir, Osman gazed westward at those walls and saw not just another raid, but the beginning of permanence. But capturing Bursa would not be easy. Unlike the smaller forts that had fallen before, Bursa was a true city with formidable defences and thousands of inhabitants. A headlong assault would bleed Osman's forces dry, so instead he turned to siege warfare, long, slow and relentless. The strategy was simple, but effective. Starve the city, isolate it, choke it into submission. Osman's men established fortified outposts around Bursa, cutting roads and harassing supply lines. Imagine standing watching one of those outposts, your breath fogging in the night as you peer at the distant city lights. Each week fewer carts reached its gates, fewer peasants dared to bring goods. Inside Bursa, food prices climbed, tempers frayed, and hunger gnawed at stomachs. Osman didn't just rely on brute force. He used psychology. Messages were sent into the city promising fair treatment if they surrendered, reminding inhabitants of how other towns had fared better under his rule than under distant Constantinople. The Byzantines, already stretched thin, could offer no relief. The emperor had other crises to juggle, and Bithynia was sliding from his grasp like sand through his fingers. Here's a reality check. A medieval siege was misery for everyone. If you were a citizen inside Bursa, you'd feel it first in your belly. Bread dwindled, then meat, then even weeds and bark became meals. Disease crept in as hunger weakened bodies. You'd watch children cry themselves to sleep, hear whispers that perhaps surrender would be better than starving. If you were a soldier in Osman's outposts, life wasn't easy either. Cold nights, monotonous patrols, sudden skirmishes with desperate foragers. But you had food, you had faith, and you believed in the dream. That difference made all the difference. As months turned into years, Bursa's isolation deepened. Osman's warriors tightened the noose. Outlying villages once loyal to Bursa began to shift allegiance, providing food and information to Osman instead. Slowly, the city was not just besieged, it was surrounded by a new reality. Meanwhile, Osman himself grew frailer. Age and illness weighed on him. By the mid-1320s, he was no longer the vigorous raider leading charges at the front. He directed campaigns from his tent, voice rasping but mind sharp. His son Oyhan increasingly took command in the field. For the Ghazis, this wasn't a crisis. It was succession in motion. Osman's dream had not dimmed. It was simply being carried by the next branch of the tree. The siege dragged on, a slow suffocation. For the people inside Bursa, hope shrank. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty, could not rescue them. Constantinople was too distant, its coffers too empty, its armies too scattered. Messages from the capital promised aid, but aid never came. The city was, for all practical purposes, abandoned. Finally, in 1326, after years of pressure, Bursa surrendered. By then, Osman himself was near death, too ill to see the city fall with his own eyes. It was Orhan who led the final negotiations and marched into Bursa, but the victory was credited to Osman, for it was his long vision, his patient strategy, that had made it possible. Imagine the scene as Orhan's warriors entered the gates. Instead of chaos and massacre, there was order. The city was claimed for the Ottomans. Its churches converted gradually. Its markets reopened under new taxation. Its people spared wholesale slaughter. For the Byzantines, it was humiliation. For Osman's followers, it was triumph. Bursa was not just a fortress. It was a city, a symbol of permanence, a capital worthy of an empire in the making. And if you had been with Osman in his last days, you would have heard his request that he be buried in Bursa. He wanted his final rest not in Surgut, where his journey had begun, but in the city that marked the true birth of his state. The Though he died before the conquest was completed, his wish was honoured. Ul-Khan buried him in Bursa, in a simple tomb that still stands today. The siege of Bursa was more than the taking of a city. It was the transition from frontier principality to urban power. It proved that Osman's movement was not a passing storm, but a lasting force. From Bursa, the Ottomans would launch the next stages of expansion, building on the foundation Osman had laid. And if you stand on Bursa's hills even now, you can almost hear the echoes of that long siege, the distant cries of hunger, the clash of skirmishes in the night, the steady patience of Osman's men. You can feel the weight of a moment when history tilted, when the dream of a tree shading the world sent down roots in stone and soil. Osman's sword had opened the way, but Bursa was the doorway. Step through it, and you are no longer in the world of tribes and raids. You are in the world of empires, alliances and rivalries. This was the lifeblood of Osman's world. You cannot build a state on raids alone. You need friends when convenient, enemies to sharpen your edge, and a constant balancing act between survival and ambition. On the frontier, loyalty was often worth as much as a sword, and betrayal could cut deeper than steel. Let's set the board. By the early 1300s, Osman's principality sat in a complicated neighbourhood. To the west lay the tottering Byzantines, exhausted but still clinging to their walled cities. To the east sprawled other Turkish beyliks, Karamanids, Germianoglar and smaller principalities, each with their own ambitions, each suspicious of the others. To the northeast, the Ilkhanid Mongols still cast their long shadow, demanding tribute and meddling in Anatolian politics. Osman was like a wolf in a forest full of other wolves, always watching, always gauging, always ready to pounce or retreat. His first and most obvious enemy was Byzantium. Yet even here, the lines blurred. Some Byzantine governors, isolated and poorly supplied, preferred to make quiet deals with Osman rather than fight hopeless battles. It wasn't uncommon for a local commander to surrender a fort in exchange for safe passage or a promise of fair treatment. Others went further, joining Osman outright. Greek mercenaries, disillusioned by unpaid wages from Constantinople, entered his service, bringing skills in siegecraft and fortification that Osman's Ghazis eagerly absorbed. But rivals could become allies too. Consider Osman's fellow Turkish beyliks. The Karamanids, larger and stronger, sometimes tried to dominate the smaller principalities, including Osman's. Osman had to tread carefully, maintaining enough independence to grow while avoiding outright destruction. Marriages were a key tool. By marrying his family into other clans, Osman wove a web of alliances that softened rivalries and created buffers. His own marriage to Bala Hatun, daughter of Sheikh Edebali, was not just spiritual. It connected him to dervish networks that stretched across Anatolia, giving him allies in unexpected places. Then there was diplomacy with the Mongols. The Ilkhanids were still the overlords of Anatolia in name, though their grip weakened with each passing decade. Many beyliks paid them tribute. Osman, too small at first to matter, managed to avoid direct confrontation by focusing westward on Byzantine lands rather than eastward against other Turks or Mongols. He sidestepped many traps that might have destroyed him early. This too was a kind of alliance, an alliance of avoidance. You, sitting in Osman's council tent during this period, would hear heated debates. Some warriors argued for constant war against Byzantines, hungry for loot. Others urged caution, warning that too much expansion might provoke the Mongols or Karamanids. Osman listened, weighed, and chose carefully. He was not reckless. He struck when opportunity was ripe, but he also held back when the cost was too high. His strength was not just bravery, but patience. Alliances also grew from faith. Dervishes and Sufi orders acted as connectors between tribes and regions. By hosting them, supporting their lodges, and respecting their authority, Osman gained not only spiritual legitimacy, but also networks of loyalty that stretched far beyond his immediate territory. These spiritual alliances mattered in a world where religion and politics were inseparable. To fight with Osman was to join not only a military band, but a divine mission. Still, rivalry never disappeared. Neighbouring beyliks sometimes clashed with Osman's forces over pasture lands or raids. The Germianids, for example, eyed his growing power with suspicion. Even within his own principality, ambitious warriors occasionally tested his authority. Osman dealt with these challenges firmly. When rivals could be married or persuaded into loyalty, he chose that path. When they couldn't, he fought, and his victories reinforced his legitimacy. Think of this period like a chess game played on a board where the pieces are alive and unpredictable. A knight one day might switch sides and fight for the enemy. A pawn might suddenly become a queen through marriage or alliance. Osman had to think several moves ahead, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he rarely blundered. One example often cited is the way Osman and his successors handled the city of Nasir, Iznik. Instead of rushing headlong into a costly siege, they slowly strangled it, cutting off its countryside, forming alliances with nearby villages, and waiting until the city was ripe for the taking. This patience reflected Osman's broader strategy: weaken your enemy with alliances and isolation before striking with force. Here's a modern aside: if Osman were playing an online strategy game, he wouldn't be the one spamming attacks and exhausting resources. He'd be the one quietly building alliances, stockpiling strength, and letting rivals tire themselves out before swooping in for the win. Annoying to play against? Absolutely. Effective? Completely. Diplomacy also extended into how Osman ruled newly conquered lands. He didn't expel or massacre entire populations. Instead, he often kept local elites in place, requiring only tribute and loyalty. This approach turned potential rivals into allies, or at least into manageable subjects. It also made conquest less costly. Why waste energy rebuilding a city from ashes when you could inherit it intact with a new flag on the wall? If you walked through Osman's court at this time, you'd see envoys from other Beyliks, Greek villagers petitioning for fair treatment, dervishes whispering counsel, and warriors boasting of victories. It was a lively, chaotic, but increasingly organized hub of power, and at the center Osman sat, eyes keen, voice measured, balancing friendships and feuds with the skill of a tightrope walker. Rivalries tested him, alliances strengthened him. Each taught lessons, each shaped his principality into something sturdier. By mastering this delicate dance, Osman did more than survive. He positioned his state as the rising power in Anatolia. Others faltered, fell, or faded into obscurity. Osman, by contrast, endured, and endurance was the true measure. Anyone could win a raid, few could build a state. Osman's genius was not only in seizing territory but in weaving it into a fabric of alliances, loyalties, and rivalries managed with care. That fabric would hold, and through it, the small KE principality would one day become the Ottoman Empire. So here you are, sitting in the glow of firelight in Yenişehir. Envoys argue in the council, warriors sharpen their swords, dervishes chant their blessings. Beyond the walls, enemies still plot, but within the tent, you feel something unshakable. This is no longer just Osman the raider. This is Osman the statesman, the diplomat, the founder of an order that rivals cannot break. The rise of Orhan begins quietly, almost in the background, as Osman's health weakens and the responsibilities of leadership grow too heavy for one aging man to carry alone. If you have been walking alongside Osman's story until now, you will notice a subtle shift in the camp. The warriors still chant Osman's name, the dervishes still speak of his dream, but increasingly it is Orhan, his son, who leads the raids, directs the sieges, and carries the sword into battle. Orhan was born into this frontier world. He didn't know the endless migrations of the steppe that shaped Ertuğrul, or the first fragile years of Seljuk under Osman. Instead, he grew up in a principality already forged by raids, alliances, and the beginnings of permanence. Imagine a boy watching his father's victories, hearing the stories of the dream, listening to Sheikh Edebali's sermons. By the time he was a young man, Orhan had inherited not just Osman's blood, but also his vision. Descriptions of Orhan often emphasize his calm nature, his patience. If Osman was the spark, Orhan was the steady flame. He was not reckless, not impulsive. He learned from his father that power comes not only from the sword, but also from fairness and foresight. When Osman began to falter with age, Orhan stepped naturally into leadership roles, commanding raids, leading negotiations, and slowly proving himself to the warriors. Picture Orhan at Yeni Shehe, mounted on horseback at the head of a raiding party. His armor gleams, his banner flutters, his men follow without hesitation. He rides into Byzantine territory, strikes at a fort or village, and returns victorious. Each raid adds to his credibility. Around campfires, warriors begin to speak his name, with the same respect they once reserved for Osman. They whisper that the tree of destiny is already spreading its branches through him. Succession in tribal societies is always dangerous. Brothers, cousins, ambitious commanders, anyone might try to claim leadership when a bey weakens. But Osman had prepared carefully. By giving Orhan responsibilities early, by letting him lead and prove himself, he ensured that when the time came, Orhan would be accepted as his natural heir. The transition would not be easy, but it would be smoother than most. Orhan's rise was tied closely to military success. During the long siege of Bursa, he played a central role, organizing outposts, leading skirmishes, keeping the pressure constant. Imagine standing in one of those outposts on a chilly night. The fires burn low, the men are weary, but Orhan walks among them, speaking quietly, encouraging, promising that their patience will soon be rewarded. That kind of leadership matters. It kept morale alive during years of slow siege. He also began to show skill in administration. Orhan understood that conquering land was only half the task. Ruling it was the other half. He organized taxes, ensured markets functioned, and kept both Muslim and Christian subjects reasonably content. This was continuity of Osman's policy: pragmatism over fanaticism, tolerance where possible, firmness where necessary. The people of Bithynia, weary of Byzantine neglect, found Orhan's governance preferable. And yet, Orhan was no mere caretaker of his father's legacy. He was already thinking beyond. Where Osman had built the foundation, Orhan envisioned walls and towers rising upon it. He was the one who would turn a principality into something resembling a true state. You can almost hear the conversations between father and son. This man, frail but sharp, speaks of patience, of alliances, of the dream. Orhan listens, nods, and then adds his own thoughts. How to organize permanent garrisons, how to mint coins, how to expand the siege works at Bursa. It is a passing of knowledge, a passing of fire from one torch to another. For the warriors, the shift was clear. They loved Osman, but they saw in Orhan the future. When Orhan rode, they rode. When he spoke, they listened. And when he led them into battle, they followed with the same fervor they had once given his father. This was no small achievement. Many a tribe had collapsed when a founder died, splintered by rival claims. Osman's foresight and Orhan's competence prevented that fate. Here's a reality check. You probably wouldn't want to be Orhan during these years. Imagine the pressure. Your father is a living legend, the man of the dream, the founder of a state. Everyone looks at you and wonders, can you live up to that? Will you falter and waste it all? Or will you carry the tree forward? Every victory is measured against Osman's. Every decision is compared to his wisdom. The weight of expectation is enormous. And yet, Orhan bore it well. He was no fiery raider eager for reckless glory. He was deliberate, patient, steady. Those qualities would prove crucial when Osman finally died, leaving him the mantle of leadership. One small but telling detail: Orhan introduced new military organization. Instead of purely tribal levies, he began to develop a more permanent force, soldiers tied not just by kinship, but by pay and structure. This was the seed of what would later become the famed Ottoman military system. It was still rudimentary, but it showed foresight. Orhan understood that to rule cities like Bursa, you needed more than raiders. You needed an army that could hold, defend, and expand. So here you are, watching Orhan's rise. The fires of Bursa's siege flicker in the distance. Osman, aged and frail, speaks less each day, while Orhan speaks more. The men look to him not as the son of their bey, but as their commander in his own right. Slowly, quietly, the mantle shifts. When the siege finally ends and Bursa falls in 3026, It is Orhan who enters the city, Orhan who organizes its administration, Orhan who claims it as the new capital. Osman had dreamed of it, planned it, perhaps even ordered it, but Orhan carried it out. In that moment, the transition is complete. Osman's star had risen and blazed. Now it was Orhan's turn to shine, carrying forward the dream of the great tree, its branches spreading wider with each passing year. The fall of Bursa in 1326 was the thunderclap that announced to the world that Osman's principality had grown into something far larger than a raiding frontier state. For decades, Osman and his warriors had been steadily carving away at Byzantine Bithynia, seizing forts, strangling roads and starving cities. Bursa, however, was the jewel of the region, a city whose conquest would transform Osman's movement from a tribal principality into the core of a new power. Let's set the stage. Bursa sat at the foot of Mount Uludağ, surrounded by fertile plains. The city's walls rose proudly, enclosing churches, markets and houses of stone. It was a hub for silk production, trade and agriculture. Whoever controlled Bursa controlled wealth, population and legitimacy. For the Byzantines, losing it would mean surrendering their last real hold on the region. For the Ottomans, taking it meant securing a permanent capital worthy of an empire. The siege had stretched for years. Osman had ordered the city encircled long before his death. Outposts were built on the hills around Bursa, roads cut off, supplies intercepted. Life inside became a slow torture of hunger and despair. Imagine being a citizen during those years. Bread vanished first, then meat. Prices soared beyond reach. Families boiled weeds, stripped bark from trees, anything to fill their stomachs. Merchants slipped away, fields outside the walls lay untended, and the once vibrant city withered behind its proud walls. Outside, the Ottomans tightened their grip. Siege camps became semi-permanent settlements, with tents giving way to wooden structures, even gardens and small markets to sustain the besiegers. If you stood in one of those camps, you might almost forget it was a siege. The Ghazis trained, children played, dervishes preached. Life carried on as if they were already the masters of Bursa. That psychological victory mattered. For the Ottomans, Bursa was already theirs in spirit long before its gates opened. By the early 1320s, Osman himself was too ill to lead, but Orhan carried forward the siege with relentless patience. Unlike some commanders who threw men at walls in desperate assaults, Orhan waited, strangling the city slowly, knowing time was his ally. Byzantium could not relieve Bursa. Constantinople was mired in its own crises, its treasury empty, its armies thin. Relief never came. Finally, in 1326, the defenders of Bursa could endure no longer. Negotiations opened. Orhan promised fair treatment, safety for the inhabitants, and preservation of life and property. The gates opened, and Ottoman banners rose above the walls. There was no catastrophic sack, no massacre, just the quiet, inexorable change of rulers. The city that had once been proudly Byzantine became Ottoman. Now, picture the scene as Orhan entered. His warriors marched behind him, banners snapping, drums beating a steady rhythm. Citizens lined the streets, wary but relieved that bloodshed had been avoided. Priests clutched their icons nervously, while dervishes whispered prayers of triumph. At the citadel, the Byzantine flag was lowered, and Osman's dream was fulfilled. The city, like a ripe fruit, had finally fallen into their hands. And here's the poignant truth. Osman himself never saw it. He had died just before Bursa's final surrender, frail and worn by illness. His body was laid to rest in the city he had longed for, buried on a hill overlooking the streets his son now ruled. In that burial, symbolism fused with destiny. Osman, the frontier bee, became Osman Ghazi, the founder, the father of a dynasty whose roots were now planted deep in urban soil. For the Ottomans, Bursa was not just a conquest, it was a transformation. Seljuk had been a frontier outpost, Karakaya a symbolic fortress, Yenişehir a temporary headquarters, but Bursa was a capital. Here, the Ottomans established their first true administrative center. Markets thrived again, this time under Ottoman taxes. Churches were converted, some into mosques, signaling a shift in identity but also continuity in urban life. Artisans, Merchants and farmers carried on, now under a new master who promised order and justice. Economically, Bursa gave the Ottomans wealth. Its silk industry connected them to wider trade networks. Its fertile lands filled their granaries, and its strategic position linked them to both the Aegean and the Anatolian interior. Politically, it gave them legitimacy. No longer could rivals dismiss Osman's heirs as mere raiders. They were now rulers of a great city, and that meant permanence. Imagine standing in Bursa's marketplace a few months after the conquest. Turkish and Greek merchants haggle over goods. Ottoman officials collect taxes with new efficiency. Soldiers patrol streets, their presence firm but not oppressive. Life resumes quickly, because Orhan ensured that stability replaced chaos. This was a hallmark of Ottoman rule: conquest followed by continuity, not destruction. The fall of Bursa also sent shockwaves beyond. Other beyliks looked on with envy and alarm. The Byzantines mourned another loss in a string of defeats. Even the Mongols, though distant, must have taken note that a new power was consolidating in western Anatolia, and among Osman's followers, confidence soared. The dream of empire no longer felt like a tale told by dervishes. It was visible, tangible, undeniable. Here's your cheeky modern aside. If Osman's life were a video game campaign, the capture of Bursa was the level-up moment when you unlock the capital city feature. Suddenly, you can build infrastructure, mint coins, and recruit larger armies. Everything changes. That's what Bursa did for the Ottomans. It unlocked empire mode. But beyond the strategy, think of the human side. Osman, once a young warrior leading night raids for cattle, had died knowing that his people were on the cusp of greatness. Orhan, his son, took that legacy and anchored it in stone walls and bustling markets. The warriors who once rode out for loot now stood guard in a true city, defending not just plunder but a home. If you wander Bursa's streets at this moment in history, you feel it in the air, the sense of permanence, of destiny unfolding, of a tree spreading its branches over new soil. This is no longer a story about a tribe on the frontier. This is the story of a state, a dynasty, a power that will not only survive but dominate. The fall of Bursa marks the hinge. Before it, Osman's principality was fragile, its victories uncertain, its survival never guaranteed. After it, the Ottomans were undeniable. An empire had taken root. Osman's death and legacy bring us to a quiet but powerful moment in the story. For decades, you've watched him rise from a tribal chieftain to a founder of states, from the dust of Seljuks' pastures to the shadow of Bursa's walls. And then, as Bursa finally fell in 1326, Osman himself slipped away, too frail to see with his own eyes the city that would become his first great capital. His passing, like so much of his life, was tied inseparably to the land and people he had shaped. Imagine Osman in his last days. His body weak, breath shallow, he no longer rides at the front of raids or councils under the stars. Instead, he lies in a tent near Yenişehir, surrounded by family, dervishes, and loyal warriors who whisper prayers into the quiet air. Outside, the siege of Bursa grinds on. The sounds of war hammers on siegworks, cries of warriors, the thud of arrows against shields still echo faintly. Osman listens, knowing that his dream is almost fulfilled. He doesn't need to see the city fall. He knows it will. His final counsel to Orhan, as recorded in later chronicles, reflects both pragmatism and faith. He urged his son to treat subjects with fairness, to protect dervishes, to honor the law of God, and to rule with justice rather than cruelty. These weren't empty platitudes. They were the guiding principles that had allowed a tribal band to become a state. For Osman, leadership was not only about conquest, but about legitimacy, about binding people together with more than fear. And so, with his son at his side, Osman died. His warriors grieved, but not with despair. Unlike so many frontier leaders whose deaths meant the collapse of their fragile realms, Osman had built something enduring. Orhan stepped naturally into leadership, accepted by warriors and subjects alike. Continuity, not chaos, followed Osman's death. That alone was a measure of his success. His burial was deeply symbolic. Though he had wished to be interred in Bursa, He died before its fall. When the city surrendered, Orhan carried out his father's wish, moving his remains into the heart of the newly conquered capital. Osman's tomb still stands there today, overlooking the city he had long dreamed of taking. In that resting place, the symbolism is heavy. Osman the founder, sleeping forever in the soil of his first true capital, the city that marked the transformation of his dream into reality. Now let's pause and reflect. What exactly was Osman's legacy at the moment of his death? On the surface it was modest, a principality stretching across parts of Bithynia, a handful of cities and forts, perhaps a few tens of thousands of subjects at most. Compared to the Byzantine Empire, still holding Constantinople, or the Mongols, still lording over Persia, it was small, but small seeds grow into vast forests. And Osman's principality contained the essence of empire. First, his dynasty. Osman left behind not only land but a family line imbued with legitimacy, strengthened by myths like the famous Dream, and reinforced by marriages to spiritual and political allies. Dynastic continuity was never guaranteed in the medieval world, but Osman had laid the groundwork for his heirs to rule securely. Second, his institutions. Primitive though they were, Osman's principality had already developed systems of taxation, justice, and administration. He had shown tolerance toward conquered Christians, integrating them rather than expelling them. He had cultivated alliances with dervishes and spiritual leaders, ensuring that faith and politics marched together. These were the skeleton of a state that his successors would flesh out. Third, his vision. Osman had shifted the mindset of his people from survival to destiny. The Ghazis who had once ridden out for loot now believed they were part of something larger, something ordained. The dream of the tree was no longer just a tale, it was a mission. That sense of purpose endured beyond Osman's life, carried forward by Orhan, then by Murad, then by Bayezid, and onward until the empire stretched across continents. And finally, his memory. Even in the decades immediately after his death, Osman was remembered as Osman Ghazi, Osman the warrior, the founder. Later generations of Ottomans looked back to him as their source of legitimacy. Every sultan who took the throne would carry the weight of his name, tracing their line proudly back to that small frontier bey who dared to challenge Byzantium. The sword of Osman became a symbol of continuity, passed from ruler to ruler at coronations, tying each new sultan to the founder's legacy. As a cheeky modern aside, Osman was basically the ultimate founder effect. In genetics, the founder effect is when a small group starts something that shapes generations to come. Osman was that for the Ottomans. His choices, his policies, his myths, they shaped the DNA of an empire that would last for over 6 centuries. But Osman's legacy wasn't just institutional or symbolic, it was personal. His followers remembered him as a leader who fought at the front, shared their hardships, divided spoils fairly, and listened to their grievances. They didn't just fear him, they loved him. That love is what transformed loyalty into permanence. Many warlords inspired fear, few inspired devotion. Osman inspired both, and that combination was explosive. Standing at his tomb in Bursa, you can almost hear the echoes of those early days, the clatter of hooves on the frontier, the crack of arrows, the chants of dervishes, the laughter around campfires. You can feel the raw energy of a man who started with nothing more than a tribe and a dream, and left behind a dynasty and a capital. Osman's death closed one chapter but opened another. With Orhan at the helm, the Ottomans would expand further, taking Nicaea, Nicomedia, and eventually crossing into Europe. The tree would spread exactly as the dream foretold, its branches reaching further than Osman himself could have imagined. But the roots of that tree, they were Osman's legacy, planted deep in the soil of Seljuk, watered with raids and faith, strengthened by patience and vision, and crowned forever by his resting place in Bursa. So as you step away from his tomb, you realize this is not an ending, it is a beginning. Osman may have died, but the empire he fathered was only just awakening. His name, whispered in tents and echoed in palaces, would live for centuries as both memory and destiny. The birth of empire did not come with a trumpet blast or a proclamation carved in stone. It came in the slow accumulation of victories, the patient weaving of alliances, the long siege of cities, and the steady passing of leadership from father to son. When Osman died and Orhan entered Bursa in 1326, the Ottomans crossed a threshold. They were no longer a frontier principality. They were an empire in embryo, already stretching its branches wider than any could have imagined a generation earlier. Let's stand for a moment in Bursa after its conquest. Markets hum with renewed energy, silk looms clatter, filling storerooms with goods bound for distant lands. Farmers plough the fertile plains around the city, relieved to work without the constant fear of raiders. Taxes are collected, yes, but fairly, with the promise of security in return. Churches still stand, though some are converted to mosques, marking the new identity of the city. Life continues, but under a new rhythm, the rhythm of Osman's heirs. From this base, the Ottomans began their true expansion. Orhan moved swiftly to capture Nicaea Iznik in 1331, then Nicomedia Iznik in 1337. With those victories, the Byzantines lost their last real footholds in northwestern Anatolia. Constantinople still stood proud, but its hinterland was gone. Imagine standing on the walls of the great city, looking east, and realizing the land that had once fed you now belonged to Osman's descendants. The anxiety must have been palpable, the sense of encirclement heavy, but the Ottomans didn't stop at Anatolia. By mid-century they were already probing across the Dardanelles into Europe. Orhan's son, Suleiman Pasha, led expeditions that captured Gallipoli in the 1350s, establishing the first Ottoman foothold in Thrace. From there, the empire would pour into the Balkans, conquering cities and kingdoms, until within a century they would stand at the gates of Constantinople itself. Step back and think about that trajectory. In less than 100 years, the Ottomans went from a modest tribe in Seljuk to masters of Bursa, Nicaea and Nicomedia, with one foot planted firmly in Europe. The speed is staggering, but the foundation was Osman's. Without his careful balancing of raids and governance, his cultivation of legitimacy through dervishes and dreams, his patient strategy of expansion, none of this would have been possible. And yet, what makes the Ottoman story unique is not only military expansion, it is the way Osman's vision created a dynasty that endured. Many frontier beys won victories, seized cities, and dreamed of greatness. Most were forgotten within a generation, their domains swallowed by rivals. Osman's principality, however, survived and thrived. Why? Because Osman left behind more than victories. He left behind institutions, legitimacy and identity. His name itself became the root. Ottoman derived from Osmanlı. The followers of Osman, an empire that would span 3 continents, took its identity from one man. Here's a cheeky modern aside. If Osman were a startup founder, this is the moment when the company went public. The small group of friends coding in a garage or raiding from a tent, in his case, had become a full-scale enterprise with offices, staff and revenue streams. And the IPO, that was Bursa, Iznik, Izmit, the visible proof to the world that this was no longer a small project, but a powerhouse ready to dominate the market. The birth of empire was also the birth of myth. Later chroniclers would polish Osman's story, shaping him into a near-legendary figure. They told of his dream, his justice, his faith, his wisdom. Whether every detail was true or not didn't matter. The myth became part of the fabric of Ottoman identity. Every sultan traced his legitimacy back to Osman. Every ceremony evoked his memory. Every conquest was framed as the flowering of the tree that had sprouted from his chest. You, standing in the early decades after Osman's death, would feel that myth already taking hold. Warriors spoke of him not just as a leader, but as a chosen man. Subjects remembered him as fair and protective. His tomb in Bursa became a place of reverence, and in the councils of Orhan and his successors, Osman's principles, justice, patience, faith, were repeated as guiding lights. Of course, the empire was still fragile. Rivals remained. Byzantium still clung to Constantinople, and the Mongols were not entirely gone from the horizon, but the direction was clear. The Ottomans were rising, and nothing short of catastrophe could stop them. So here you are, watching the birth of empire, You've walked with Osman through the dust of the frontier, through raids and dreams, through alliances and sieges. You've watched him die, and you've watched his son carry his vision into stone walls and fertile plains. And now, you see the tree standing tall, its roots sunk deep, its branches beginning to stretch across continents. The birth of empire is not just about conquests, it's about a sense of inevitability, and standing here in the shadow of Bursa, you feel it. The inevitability of the Ottomans, the inevitability of Osman's dream, the inevitability that this modest principality has become something far greater. The small bey from Seljuk has given the world a dynasty. His name will echo for centuries, whispered in palaces, shouted on battlefields, carved into history. Osman is gone, but the empire he birthed has only just begun to rise. Now the story softens, the drums fade, and the voices of warriors dim. The fires of the frontier burn low, their smoke curling gently into the night air. You sit quietly in Bursa, near the tomb of Osman, feeling the hush of a city that has lived through siege and surrender, and now rests in the stillness of a new beginning. The weight of battle slides from your shoulders, and the clash of steel is replaced by the murmur of fountains in courtyards, the whisper of silk in markets, the distant song of a muezzin calling softly through the dawn air. History, which thundered so loudly a moment ago, now breathes in calm rhythm. You close your eyes and picture the great tree of Osman's dream, its branches swaying gently, not in battle but in peace. Under its shade, farmers till the soil, children laugh in the streets, and weary travelers find rest. The empire is young, fragile still, but tonight it feels eternal. Its roots deep, its promise sure. Let the images blur now, tents dissolving into palaces, the crack of arrows softening into lullabies, the harsh dust of the frontier settling into fertile earth. Osman's story has been told, his journey traced from restless warrior to the father of an empire. The noise fades, the world stills, and only the calm remains. As you drift into sleep, remember this: the rise of Osman was not just about battles won or cities taken. It was about endurance, vision, and the quiet power of belief. The dream of a single man became the destiny of millions. Rest easy under the shade of that dream. The empire will stand watch while you sleep. Sweet dreams.